The station smelled of ozone and someone else's citrus. Nothing about the scent was accidental. Concordance Station was designed to make strangers comfortable and interns invisible, and the two effects often overlapped. Leo Marsh had been trained to disappear, literally, in the background hum of the translators, the wash of adaptive light, the little polite nods that meant, "Keep moving, we are conducting statecraft." He had not been trained for the particular embarrassment of sitting in the wrong chair. It was not a dramatic wrongness. The chair he chose offered a marginally better view of the starfield. It was slightly warmer beneath the alloy weave. It happened because a translator misregistered his clearance, because his left shoe snagged on ceremonial fabric, because he had read the seating map wrong while trying to soothe the butterflies in his upper chest. Leo told himself none of this was catastrophic. In diplomatic terms, not catastrophes were still considered acceptable. The throne beside Queen Solana sat empty. People do not expect silence to be a thing you can see. They are used to it as a pause in conversation, a breath between points. The void of the throne was different, and absence with texture. It was carved of pale luminal alloy that drank in the diffused chamber light and seemed to keep it like a held breath. The carvings along its arms suggested scales, not a coincidence. Designers like to honor the queen's lineage in public furniture. But the seat was not merely decorative. Something about its hollowness announced that a story was missing from the state tableau. It felt to Leo's strange little internal meter, like a punctuation mark left on the wrong sentence. Queen Solana entered with the kind of anonymity reserved for monarchs who had grown used to being watched. She did not sweep. Her steps were economical, calibrated to the slow beat of the council's procedural tempo. There was a tiredness to her that had an edge of care. She arrived as if she had spent the previous night folding concern into hours and tucking it under her ribs. Crowns could strain, but hers never announced itself with noise. It was more like a gravity that people adjusted to. Leo's first honest thought was not about crowns or policies. It was about the small domestic detail of how she had arranged her hands on the armrests, or rather, how she arranged them and then let one of them shift against the alloy as if testing the world's willingness to hold her. Around them, the chamber breathed in ritual. Translators hummed in faint polyphony, shimmering glyphs hovered between speakers, and the light field ran a slow gradient that made the viewports into painted panels of stars. Delegates rustled, feathers of clothing, folds of sleeves, a faint metallic whisper from a species whose ears still registered sound as a delicate thread.
Protocol moved like choreography. Entrances, acknowledgments, the placement of tablets, the delicate passing of eyes that meant watch. Leo was meant to watch too, but from a smaller angle. He was the junior aide posted to the right flank, nominally to record, nominally to carry micro requests and bear witness to ceremonial form. Unofficially, he was there to be replaced if anyone with more sense arrived. Sitting in the wrong chair increased his anxiety until it felt like a low tide pulling on his muscles. He could feel his palms produce a nervous film. He imagined, with the private terror of someone who had once been scolded by a distant supervisor, that the security screens were counting his micro-failings. A chamber attendant, the species that accompanied the Queen's passage with a cool absence of expression, slid a closed panel into place on a support rail. Leo didn't know if it was to screen the Dragon Pavilion or to shield visiting delegates from some private detail of the Queen's retinue, but the small metal click made his ears prickle. He learned later in the slow cataloging of details that people expect you to know after you've been seen, that the 2 dragon babies were in the pavilion under temporary care. For now, they were mythic and fragile ideas, life bounded in a quieter room, stirred by soft thermals and the tiniest of breaths. Then, somewhere across the council's polite air, a murmured translation reached the center lectern. The Emperor, her consort, was absent. The word absence slid across the chamber like an oil slick. People did not interrupt their roles because of absences. They made use of them. An empty seat was a lever. A hollow throne was an argument. Leo's inner voice kept trying to make jokes. It is a coping mechanism, that private sarcasm that pretends to be braver than it is. "You sat in the wrong seat and did not die," the voice said, sharp and embarrassed. He suppressed the laugh. The courtiers were not rude, they were careful. They had rehearsed all their expressions to look precise under scrutiny. The Emperor had abandoned her and their 2 dragon babies. The phrase lodged in Leo with the blunt force of fact. It was not gossip. It was the explicit, improbable geometry that made the room twitch. He had read the briefing notes about the emperor's withdrawal, phrases that described political recalibration and diplomatic repositioning, but those documents had been written in the thin, antiseptic language of policy. This was different. Saying it aloud in the council's ear changed it from abstract to immediate. It made the queen's composure and action measured against a visible void. Solana listened as if she were cataloging tiny weather patterns. Her jaw did not clench. Her lips did not form a public script of defiance or entreaty. She allowed the sentences to land and then folded them inward. Leo learned to read those little movements as someone learns to read the tides.
When she adjusted the hem of her sleeve, it was not a distraction. It was a measurement of strength. When she arranged her fingers along the armrest, it was a test of the world's willingness to keep holding her. The council began its liturgy of negotiation. Delegates rose with formalities folded into the rhythm of their voices. One by one, they outlined grievances about trade routes and resource rights, about patrol overlaps and minor border irritations. The chamber's surface was so calm that Leo had to remind himself that beneath the choreography there were teeth, alliances, mercenaries, old debts. A treaty was not a contract. It was a promise made visible enough that other actors could not stop themselves from obeying the form. The first wave of questions rolled soft and legitimate. Can the Queen's administration continue supply supervision? What mechanisms would protect the dragon hatchlings' welfare on the station? Which captain would be assigned to the royal pavilion? Protocol required answers. So did the fact of the throne's emptiness. Leo's job at moments like these was to be small and useful. He sent tablets across the aisle. He read back the clause numbers. He made notes in the margins of things that others could cite. Mostly, he tried not to be noticed. But being adjacent to the throne had a way of making one visible in the most inconspicuous way. The seat's shadow touched him. He felt the weight of attention in a line that started at his shoes and went up, as if the room itself wanted to see whether anyone would care. As procedure demanded, a delegate spoke about guardianship. The speaker was from a trade confederacy known for meticulous hours in negotiation rooms. They spoke with the practiced care of someone who had built their career out of making others believe that they were only asking polite questions. Translator glyphs glittered as the words were rendered. The Confederate's tone suggested concern, not malice, but concern had a way of containing accusation. How will the Queen ensure the hatchlings' immunity to the station's microswarm? They asked. What succession clarities exist if such a personal abandonment becomes a state matter? It was a question threaded with policy and with opinion. Leo felt the room tilt toward a narrative that the court would rather not own, that without a consort, the Queen's political center might wobble. He thought of the two dragon babies, tiny, hot-breathed, useless for politics in any functional way, yet terrifyingly elemental in symbolic terms. They were, by virtue of blood and myth, doubly vulnerable, offspring of a ruler and an absent consort whose choice to leave had turned parenthood into a matter of public interest. Solana answered with the economy that had become her hallmark. When she spoke, words landed like measured stones. She did not try to make light. She did not invite pity.
She said, simply, that the station had protocols in place, that the pavilion would be staffed by vetted guardians, that the council's care for the hatchlings was both a moral and political obligation. Her voice was flat, not because she did not feel, but because she was choosing how to allocate her feelings. Grief was not a private weather condition to be hidden entirely. It was a resource you could distribute if you were wise. She met the delegate's eyes just long enough that the translator's glyphs preserved the cadence of her intention. The wording was precise. Care, obligation, oversight. Not apology, not plea. Leo noted with the helpless intimacy of someone who was watching from the sidelines of someone else's grief that her breathing changed only in small increments. A sleeve tug, a momentary tightening of her fingers. The kind of thing that, if you were paying enough attention, you could feel as a pull on your own world. He watched the muscles gather around her wrist like someone drawing a curtain slowly. She did not collapse. She did not pretend to be other than she was. A delegate from the northern enclave, a species with ribbed vocal bags that made their speech sound like a low bell, offered statistical assurances. They spoke about supply runs and security perimeters. Their language was meant to soothe commerce. Another delegate wondered aloud about the legality of the emperor's abandonment. Was it a private decision or a form of abdication? Abandonment, the word itself, was being dislocated and examined. It was being treated as a technicality. Leo had a small, unprofessional urge to stand up and shout that abandonment was not a clause you could parse without naming the wound. But he was trained to keep internal monologues tidy. He kept his voice in his head, bitter and soft. He made a note about the translation lag. He blinked. He rearranged his fingers around the pen. Around him, the chamber's ambient tech performed its discrete translations and soft enforcement. Pressure fields made the air feel like a mild embrace, a comfort against sharp emotions. Holobars at the edge of the dais allowed delegates to call up past precedents, visual artifacts of other councils, where monarchs sat beside partners, where seats had been full and arguments therefore different. If anyone wanted to romanticize the court, they could draw from those images. For now, the images functioned as a mirror. The empty chair reflected not merely absence, but opportunity for interpretation. At one point, a junior aide across the hall made a small, conspicuous error. They misread a clause and called up an archive session where Solana and the Emperor had spoken together, laughing in a private moment that was not meant for the council floor. There was a brief ripple of discomfort. Secrets in loud rooms expand like balloons until someone lets the air out on purpose. Leo felt his stomach clench. He imagined the Queen's hand tightening.
He watched, praying in a very private way that the sets of muscles in her face would not change too much. They did not change, at least not in a theatrical sense. There was, instead, a tilt. Her chin down, a half-breath, an almost imperceptible dragging of the thumb along the armrest's carved scale. It was a small thing, and yet for Leo it opened like a door. Grief here was not theatrical surrender. It was a collection of minute measurements. If you were literate in the language of restraint, you could read it. He found himself learning to read, and learning left him with the disquieting sense of being less useful than he wanted to be. As the procedural motion continued, debates folded into their expected grooves, but the empty throne was a pressure point. People returned to it as if to see whether it had softened. A visiting delegate, older and known for the theater of his politeness, remarked casually about the Emperor's departure in a tone that suggested he was more curious about the strategic consequence than about the human cost. Leo felt the room collect itself around that word. Abandonment has a grammar that makes people uncomfortable. It insists on agency. It refuses to be a neutral fact. The Emperor's absence shifted from being a simple operational gap to a moral event. Discussion about tariffs and patrols became freighted with something more human and less negotiable. The fact of children left in the care of one parent while the other left. Someone, a delegate with a voice like paper dragged across a table, used the word in a rhetorical flourish, and the chamber had the sensation of a held breath. He said pointedly that the Emperor had abandoned the Queen and their 2 dragon babies. It was an assertion that was not a question. It landed with the weight of fact and with the cruel clarity of accusation. Naming framed the world. It rendered private pain public. The air changed. Leo felt it like an electrical current along the chair. The translator's glyphs sharpened. Some delegates straightened. There was a subtle resorting as people repositioned their arguments to accommodate the new fact. Political logic is often a matter of mathematical inversion. If the Emperor is gone, then the state might be less stable. If the state appears less stable, then demands for external oversight will become louder. The council's polite language translated that fear into policy, and policy into leverage. Silana's reaction was not the kind the chamber expected. She did not flinch with outrage. She did not loudly denounce the delegate's imputation. Her hand tightened as though someone had suddenly made a fist inside a glove. Leo watched the knuckles blanch while her fingers closed against the armrest's carved scale. The gesture arrested him. A quiet sound came from somewhere in the audience, someone who could not help but inhale a breath that trembled like the beginning of an apology. Everything that follows from anger can be measured in tiny increments. The chamber's machines translated less and then more. The Queen's jaw moved, once, as if organizing a sentence in a foreign room. Her breath found a cadence that was not the measured state cadence, nor was it private sobbing. It was a public register of someone counting the scope of the loss she had been assigned to carry. Leo made a small, decisive choice that, in other contexts, would have been nothing. He leaned forward and rested his hand lightly on the back of Solana's wrist. It was not a dramatic grab. It was not a demand. It was the gesture of a person who had trained to be invisible, making themselves available in a way that required bravery because it could be noticed. His fingers felt the warmth of her skin through the ceremonial fabric, felt the tremor that was not yet visible. He thought later that his hand had been small comfort, a curiously human act that had no official sanction and therefore no liability clause. It startled him how natural it felt, as if proximity created its own moral imperative. He had not planned to be the kind of person who offered comfort in public to a monarch. He had certainly not planned to be the kind of person whose hand could steady a queen.
At that touch, the world rearranged itself in subtle shifts. Delegates adjusted their tones, cameras brightened in their peripheral detectors, the translator's glyphs held longer on Solana's face, hungry for inflection. The Queen did not remove his hand. She did not stiffen away. Instead, her fingers tightened around the armrest with a different quality, as if she were pressing not against memory, but against a thing that might otherwise leak out. Her shoulders, a fraction of a degree lower, registered a release. The older delegate who had named the abandonment sat back, satisfied with the air of truth he had planted. He presumed, with the casual cruelty of some politicos, that the Queen would react predictably, either by collapsing public authority into private grief or by constructing a spectacle of resilience. He had chosen his gambit believing in that binary. He did not account perhaps for the arithmetic of small things, the fact that grief and governance can coexist uneasily within the same chest. Solana's next movements were the kind of governance people often forgot was part of ruling. She spoke not to the chamber, but through it. Her sentence was compact and surgical, a subtle reframing rather than a correction. The rhythm of the translators held the words steady. Leo felt them like stones skipping across water. She named the abandonment, because silence could be a kind of consent, and then immediately turned the chamber's attention to its obligations. The speech was not an emotional collapse. It was a reconstitution. When a consort leaves, the state is still required to function. When children need guardians, the council must answer.
When the throne stands empty, law must be the thing that fills it. Her logic did not ask for pity. It demanded action. Delegates murmured. Someone called for procedural confirmation. The Confederate who had asked about microswarms revised their tone. Security officers recalculated patrol shifts. Leo scribbled like a madman, the ink leaping across the page, because he had the sudden, ridiculous fear that he would forget the exact turn of phrase she used to translate absence into duty. Language, he thought, with the small private panic of people who think in checklists, is easily misquoted. He wanted the record to be right. As the debate shifted back into the rhythm of policy, small practicalities gathered to do the work that grief could not. Guardianship clauses were drafted, with the efficient cruelty of legal minds. The pavilion's maintenance schedule was affirmed. A delegate proposed an oversight panel. Another suggested a rotating caretaker roster. The empty throne receded into the background again, but its shadow remained. It had become not only an absence, but an index. Leo felt both dislocated and necessary. His earlier desire to be invisible was replaced by an urgent awareness of how being seen could be a service. The small warmth of the touch he had offered lingered in his fingers. It was an odd thing to find yourself with the moral responsibility of proximity. Who appointed him to this role? No one. That did not change the anatomy of his choice. When the council voted, the process was a slow bead of procedural affirmation. Votes slid in like careful raindrops. The treaty being discussed, the minor one about supply concessions with a clause for additional humanitarian oversight, passed with careful margins. People applauded in a muted, cultured way. Delegates rose and prepared their exits like actors finishing a scene. Solana did not stand at once. She allowed the gestures of the council to unfold, letting the machinery of agreement perform its small miracles. The position of power for her was not to take the floor and shout victory. It was to let the law do the work of authority and to ensure that the human elements did not fall through the resulting net. Her face was quietly unreadable. It was not the rawness of a woman who had no support. It was a map of deliberate restraint. As chamber attendants began the ritual clearing, Leo felt a dozen micro-requests land in his peripheral awareness. Where would the hatchlings be moved? Who would escort the queen back to her pavilion? What would be done about the emperor's property claims? He tried to be ready with answers that did not exist yet. The station favored certainty. It recoiled from stories. There was a brittle, careful humor, his own, about all of it. This is not how he had expected to spend an afternoon when he had imagined a career catalogued in orderly memos.
He pictured with a soft self-mockery the stories his friends would concoct about him. Leo Marsh, the aide who touched a queen's wrist. He did not know if the thing would be heroic or humiliating. Both were equally likely. When the floor emptied, the flow of people unraveling from their roles was a choreography he had come to know too well. Delegates tucked their tablets under arms, exchanged the necessary finalities, made their small bows. Cameras recalibrated to the exiting starfield. The print of the council's moment was left in quiet places, the tablet drafts, a half-finished clause, a tired note scribbled in a margin. Solana rose then, in the manner of someone who had authorized the work of others and was now reclaiming her own time. She moved with the steady grace of a ruler who had learned to carry both sovereignty and sorrow. Leo rose too, awkward, aware that what had happened between his hand and her wrist created a new social contour he would have to navigate. They moved through the antechamber where station attendants performed the quick, efficient ministrations of statecraft, the drying of ceremonial fabric, the resetting of temperature zones, the discreet routing of sensory dampeners to accommodate those whose species reacted badly to public grief. Here, the Dragon Pavilion's sealed doors lay along the corridor like a promise. The attendants were tight-lipped about the baby's current temperament. They were also careful to inform Leo that the hatchlings were stable and under watch. The language of comfort and the language of custody braided together in the attendant's manner. In the corridor, Solana spoke to him in a way that had the compression of sentences practiced for privacy. "Remain near," she said. It was not an order dressed up as a request. It was a precise allocation of duty. Leo's heart knocked hard enough that he imagined he could hear it. He had been promoted, if a quarter-step in a line that rarely made public promotions out of kindness. The station had assigned him a new usefulness. He felt the weight of that assignment as if it were a small mantle settling around his shoulders. It was not ceremonial, it was immediate, practical, and fraught. "You should not have sat there," she added, a note of something like wryness, perhaps gratitude, softening the edges. "I am very sorry," Leo said. It was, in its way, the only thing he knew how to offer that was also true. She allowed herself a fraction of a smile, one that did not reach the colder lines of public grammar. "You remained," she said. "That counts for something." He wanted to make a joke about the scale of kingship and the perils of seating charts. He did not. He could feel the contours of his professional life shrink and reconfigure. His presence had moved from background instrument to visible item. It would be dangerous in ways he could not yet name. It would be necessary in others. They walked past the sealed pavilion door.
A faint thermal pulse suggested the life behind it, a small, steady beat that belonged to things not yet grown enough to be dangerous. It made Leo think, irrationally, of infants' hands clasping at air. He had never been particularly good with animals. He had been better with forms and clauses and the safety of predictable bureaucracy. The dragon babies were a different category of unpredictability. They made the political abstract into something that smelled faintly of smoke, and something buttery, something prehistoric and vulnerable. The idea of them was potent in a way the treaty had never been. As they approached the Queen's private suite, less luxurious than some would imagine, more efficient, attendants drifted aside at the Queen's signal. Solana moved like someone moving into the next room of an old house, with practiced ease and a small private grief that did not announce itself. Leo felt like a man at the edge of a new city, allowed inside but not yet fluent. "Stay," she said again when they reached the threshold. She did not need to formalize it. Everyone present understood, but the word carried the weight of instruction. Leo felt as if he had been handed a map with only some survey markers placed. He would have to learn the rest by walking. He stood in the antechamber and tried to square the circle of his new tasks. There was the practical. One of the council's clerks would request a formal addendum to include guardian protocols for the hatchlings. The station's security might alter patrol routes. The Emperor's holdings might need temporary trustees. And there was the intangible, the quotidian ways in which a person's life became subject to new visibility. Where one had been an invisible cog, one had become, in a very short time, part of the scene. The Queen's suite held small private things, a holographic projector with landscape presets, a tray with citrus-scented compresses, probably for the station's atmospheric efficacy, and a low lamp that cast the room into a wash of soft color. Leo noticed these things with an attentiveness that felt like trespass. He was not used to noticing other people's private markers of comfort. Solana moved to a window that let the star field in as if it were a painting. She did not turn the way people had taught him queens turned. She turned the way someone might turn when looking at a place where a person used to stand. A silence existed between them that was not empty. It was the bracketed space where two roles were being negotiated. He felt with the sharpness of a person who had been small and was now expected to be near, that whatever companionship might grow from this moment would be underwritten by both duty and tenderness. Why did he leave?
Leo wanted to ask. It was a personal question masquerading as curiosity, and he told himself he would not ask. The rules of statecraft had many unstated prohibitions. Asking about motives was one of them.
"I do not know," she said instead, and that was all the answer given. It was not evasive so much as it was precise. The absence of motive did not mean the absence of consequence. It simply kept the moral geometry clean. The fact of the abandonment remained, and that was all the council needed to know to demand action. She sat then and let the light on her hands reveal the tiny lines of exhaustion. His hand remembered its earlier contact and sought the familiar shape. He did not reach out this time. He held the space. Being near, unassertive, became a different kind of care. "Tell me what they are recommending," she said finally. There was no trace of the domestic or of theatrical grief in the question. It was efficient, necessary. To govern under grief meant continuing the bureaucratic work of being a sovereign. It meant that private sorrow did not exempt one from the public ledger. Leo unrolled the stack of tablet notes he had jotted during the session. His handwriting looked like it had been made in haste, his grammar oddly precise. He spoke of guardianship plans, of rotating caretakers, of the proposed oversight panel and the recommended supply reroutes. When he reached the parts about the Emperor, he spoke with a voice that was smaller than the one used before the council, but steadier in its own way. He mentioned the explicit phrasing used by the delegate, that the Emperor had abandoned the Queen and their 2 dragon babies, because truth, once made public, should be acknowledged rather than evaded. Solana listened. When he finished, she folded the tablet closed. Her thumb stroked the edge where the carved scales converged. Leo felt that movement as a kind of counting. "You remained," she said again, "in the way people say necessary things to the people who have just made themselves useful. Not everyone did." It was not quite a gratitude. It was, more exactly, a recognition of fact. Tonight, in a small, unofficial way, he was a person who had chosen to stay. He tried to imagine what staying for the next weeks would look like. It would mean becoming an interface between her private mourning and the state's expectations. It might require attending to small, mundane tasks that would have a public weight, reading out names of potential guardians, accompanying her to the pavilion, drafting statements that were both honest and resilient. It would mean learning how to be present without performing. He felt unequal to the task and wanted, in a childish way, to run and hide. "You will be attached to my station," she said. It was not an offer, it was a formal assignment. "For now, you will remain with me." Leo swallowed. He thought of his mother's voice and half-remembered rebuke. "Make yourself useful, and they will feed you spare kindness." He did not want spare kindness. He wanted to do his job well. He wanted to be useful in a clear, practical way. There was a knock at the inner door.
An attendant's voice, low and precise, informed them that the pavilion reported the hatchlings stable but restless. The dragon baby's heat signature had spiked briefly. Attendants had adjusted thermals and fed them a small, fortified slurry. They sent a note. The Queen was permitted a private visitation under guard. Solana did not speak for a few breaths. The suppressed fabrics of authority and tenderness altered her face. When she spoke, it was not a request for comfort as much as it was an insistence on guardianship. "Come with me," she said, and the words were practical. Leo felt the chamber's old map fold under his feet. He stepped into the new route. The attendant opened the pavilion door, and the scent of warm mineral and faint ozone brushed his face. For a moment, the world narrowed to the small, impossible things within. 2 tiny forms curled in a nest of thermal blankets, their scales still blotched with the uneven colors of infancy. They were hot to the touch, their small breath making a sound like syllables formed in a language of smoke. Delegates had argued about them as policy. Now they were simply creatures with ribs and heat, and a mother who had to decide whether to allow the public near her child, while she herself had to remain measured. The Emperor's absence had turned them into both symbols and dependents. He did not approach them without permission. He stood at the edge of the pavilion and watched as the Queen moved to them with the cautious intimacy of a parent who has been both bereft and brave. She did not speak to them the way humans speak to infants. She murmured in quiet pulses of sound that were as much rhythm as words. The attendants who cared for the hatchlings moved around them with the gentle, exact motions of those who have been assigned to hold a fragile thing steady. Leo thought, absurdly and with a flash of naked fear, about how small he had been when he first tried to hold a kitten and discovered that the thing could pitilessly turn its claws on you. He had not been designed for parenting. He had not been designed for grief. He had, however, been designed to watch and to adjust. They spent a short, quiet time in the pavilion, a small pocket of family that was not family by legal definition, but which, for the duration, was all the family there would be.
The queen's hand hovered near the hatchling's head and then rested lightly on its scaled flank. The creature stirred and made a sound that was small and like an ember exhaling. Leo felt as though he had stepped into a space where the station's protocols could not reach. When they emerged, the light of the corridor seemed oddly sharper, as if the station had decided to underline the fact that they had returned from somewhere private. The queen's face was compressed with the narrowness of the person who has just taken in a small life and then carried it back into a public role.
Leo felt, beneath the gravity of his own secret relief, that the moment had become a hinge. They did not speak much as they moved back into the suite. Words were not always required. Solana's hand brushed Leo's wrist briefly, in a non-ceremonial contact that had no audience. It was a small acknowledgement that the station had moved them both into a new set of responsibilities. Outside, the chamber's lights had shifted to an ordered dusk. Protocol updates would be drafted, announcements would be curated. News streams across the trade routes might breathlessly translate the situation into a dozen different flavors of scandal. All of that would be done without the nuance of being there. It was strange to hold the color of private moments when the world would paint them differently. Leo sat at the small desk in the suite and catalogued what he had seen. He made note of the Queen's restraint, the delegates' rhetorical strategies, the Devillian state. He wrote down the phrase the older delegate had used, about abandonment, because it mattered that the record preserve the fact. He tried to be precise. He tried to make the thing legible. There was a small, private sound behind him. The Queen was not yet alone. She moved, quietly, into the garden alcove that overlooked the docking rings. Leo imagined her speaking to the absent seat, as if she could, by the power of naming, convert absence into something manageable. He did not eavesdrop. He could, however, hear the faint mechanical click of the station's systems adjusting. There are a dozen ways for a place to acknowledge grief. Concordance Station performed many of them in rituals of light and scent. He sat with the odd sensation of being both newly relevant and still utterly inexpert. The world had nudged him into an arrangement where human contact mattered as much as a legal clause. That was a dangerous territory in its own right. To be useful in matters of care often required making oneself vulnerable. He was not sure he was ready for that permanent exposure. Then, just as he was about to file his notes into a folder labeled with the tidy word for later, a translator pinged with the echo of a message he had not expected. It was from a delegate who had been delayed in the corridor, a clarification they wished to append to their earlier remarks. The glyphs shimmered. The message was a polite insistence that if the Emperor's absence should be extended, as rumor suggested, the Council ought to consider temporary oversight of certain duties. The advertisement in the text was efficient and cold. It smelled of policy. Leo's palms felt sweaty again. He imagined, with the private thrill of someone who loves forms, a spiral of paperwork that would now demand his attention. The procedural world continued. It would not wait for morning, but the personal world had shifted under his feet too. He thought of something small and human. How often the people he admired had been exactly those who had stayed when it made no political sense. The Queen had stayed. He had stayed. These acts of presence, of choosing not to leave, were, in their quiet way, forms of power. A soft chime announced a visitor at the suite door. A courier brought a message marked private and urgent from a delegate who had not yet filed their tablet. The content was a rumor thinly veiled as a question. Was it true that the Emperor had fled to a private cruiser? Had he taken passage with goods from the royal stores? The rumors were like threads that could unravel a cloak into shreds. Solana received the note with an expression that did not seem surprised. She read the translated line once and then folded the paper, allowing the station's attendant to take it for notation. She did not scold the courier. She did not demand gossip quelled. She allowed the bureaucracy to do what it did best: file, translate, and redistribute. "Tomorrow," she said to Leo, in the compressed voice of someone arranging obligations, "you will be present when the Oversight Committee meets. You will take notes. You will accompany my officer when she reviews the pavilion's registry." He nodded more quickly than she expected. It mattered to him that she had not asked whether he wished to stay. She had assigned him. The truth about loyalty is that sometimes it is not offered as an option. It is given or withheld. She read a draft of the public statement herself, making only small edits. Her markup was surgical. She struck out a line that overly dramatized the emperor's absence and replaced it with one that emphasized protection and continuity. The press would translate that into many things. For now, the idea was that grief would be acknowledged but not weaponized. Later that night, the chamber would be abuzz with 1,000 less careful accounts. But in that suite, in the thin hours before protocols hardened into public statements, there was a fragile economy in which the truth of the abandonment, stated plainly and without salacious comment, was recognized and then repurposed into something actionable. Leo pressed his pen into paper and felt the tick of his pulse. The station outside thrummed with the regularity of scheduled travel, ships docked and undocked like slow thought. Somewhere beyond the window, a cruiser's engine sang its private song. The emperor's presence was a rumor that could not be disproven by words alone. Motive, as had been stated, remained undefined. The council had not sought motive, it sought governance. He thought of the dragon babies now as a responsibility folded into the quiet tasks of the next days. They were not pawns for negotiation. They were entities whose care required actual labor and patience. To be guardian was to take on work without glory, the slow trimming of risks and the management of small needs.
Leo felt the weight of that. He felt the weight of that sentence settle into his bones. The idea that care could be an appendage of power, that someone else's absence could fold into the ledger and require work. The days that followed were a series of small calculations. The Oversight Committee met the next morning in a smaller chamber whose light favored argument over theater. Leo sat at the edge of a raised dais with a tablet that was mostly for show and a pen that he used to anchor his hand when his chest wanted to rearrange into panic. Delegates came with lists and contingencies. Their polite interest had hardened into proposals. They spoke about rotating custodians, about sterilized feed, about insurance bonds for royal assets. The names of statutes slid across the hollow bar, inked into precedent as if that could remake what had been lost. If you are staying for the whole moment, keep watching to see how presence becomes power. It was not a rhetorical flourish, but a practical truth. Power here was an accumulation of small stays, a clerk who resubmitted a form at odd hours, a guardian who slept near a thermobassinet, a queen who chose a word over a whale. Solana arrived and took the chair designated for the sovereign with the same economy she used in larger rooms. Her face registered the hours of the night before, pale lines around her eyes, but she moved with the economy of someone who could not afford theatrics. She listened while others spoke, marking only the things she would accept. When a delegate proposed a supervisory body populated primarily by outside representatives, she asked quietly what authority they would actually exercise. The question was both legal and rhetorical. It reframed the committee's urgency into a specific ledger. What would they be allowed to do, and for how long? A trading syndicate suggested that given the emperor's disappearance, the council might place an interim steward over the emperor's estates pending clarification. A murmur ran through the room like wind through sparing branches. Solana's hand moved, almost without thinking, to the underside of the table where a small carved scale had been inlaid years before. Her fingers found it and curled once. The motion was not showy. It was a ruling. No extraordinary stewardship will be assigned without demonstration of immediate harm, she said. The translators rendered the sentence without the beat of personal sorrow. The content did not need it. She was protecting the principle that loss did not itself equal forfeiture. The committee graded at the edges, some delegates chafing at limits they had assumed would be looser. A few argued for conservatorship over the pavilion rather than the throne, the legalist approach that framed children as assets in need of protection. Solana's reply folded into the mundane. Guardianship rights were to be allocated to vetted station attendants and to the royal household, until such time as the council authorized otherwise.
She recommended the rotating panel be advisory, not executive, with clear measures for reporting and inspection. Small things accreted to a plan. The pavilion would receive additional feed shipments. The hatchlings would be monitored by a rotating roster that prioritized continuity of caregivers over regional representation. A clause guaranteed limited media access, a single daily summary released to prevent rumor from metastasizing into leverage. It was the kind of administrative architecture that, by its presence, reduced a wound into procedures that other actors could not easily weaponize. Leo found himself translating not only language but moral geometry. In the quiet of report-taking, he recognized patterns. Grief could be hollowed out and made into work, and work could be presented again as a shield. He also noticed the small acts that were not in any clause, an attendant who had moved the hatchling's blanket a degree closer to the vent to mimic the warmth of a parent, a medic who had stayed through the night to watch a low-grade infection, a junior clerk who refused to redact an eyewitness note. After the committee, Solana retreated for an hour to the pavilion under the excuse of inspection. Leo accompanied her, certificate in hand. The pavilion smelled of mineral and the faint citrus that the station favored in public areas. Inside it was warmer, softer, the lights lowered to mimic an incubatory twilight. The hatchlings rested in a nest engineered for thermal stability, small, shivering bodies, sheathed in incomplete armor. One breathed in quick, kittenish puffs. The other lay with a wing curled over its head like a sleeping towel. Solana crouched at the edge of the nest. The attendants gave them space. She reached out, not with a ruler's hand but with a parent's gesture, tentative, sure. Her fingers found the top of a crest that was still speckled with the rawness of new scales. The creature shifted and responded, nose flaring, a tiny heat signature like a burning ember inhaling oxygen. Leo watched the pattern of her face. There was a tightness near her mouth that had not fully softened. Then, in the small privacy that the pavilion allowed, something broke as if under pressure. A wetness tracked down the jawline, quick and unannounced, a single silver thread among the pale skin. She did not pull away. She did not dissolve. She simply let the tear fall. It was a simple thing, and yet it felt like an admission with reverberations. The queen wept. The phrase told itself into the pavilion as if it needed the proof that someone had finally allowed the logic of pain to surface. Leo's breath stuttered in his chest, not from shock, but from the humble proximity of being allowed to witness. His hand once again moved forward. He placed it on the back of her wrist, the same place as before, feeling the warmth and a soft tremor. "Do not make me apologize for this," she said, voice small and precise. It was not admonishment, it was an instruction about dignity. To weep was not to abdicate authority. It was, occasionally, to mark the contour of what a person carried. They stayed like that a long time, neither performing nor hiding, a queen with a tear on her face and an aide with ink marks on his fingers. Outside the pavilion, the station hummed on. Inside, the two dragon babies slept on, heat rising in even breaths. When they returned to the suite, she was steadier, wiping at her cheek with a practiced hand. She had for a moment allowed the private thing to exist in public through the thin presence of someone who would not judge the logic of tears. The council would learn of it the next day if it became a leak. More likely it would remain a small truth between them. Leo felt, in the residual space of that shared moment, something form into definition: trust. Solana took the next step toward visible redistribution of responsibility. She asked Leo to draft a short, clear brief to be sent to the station's mercantile channels, an appeal for support specific to the hatchling's needs, not an entreaty for charity, but a call for practical supply lines. It was a public move cloaked in necessary logistics. She would not beg. She would ask institutions to perform their functions. He wrote the brief with the care of someone stitching seams. He described nutritional requirements, thermal tolerances, and the necessity of continuity in caregivers. He described the Emperor's absence factually and without rancor. Abandoned, stated as fact, motive undefined. He left out rumor. In its place, he placed tasks. The document, when routed, had the effect intended. It drew outside hands into discrete work and limited the kind of moral argument that might